welcome to The Edge. Well, we'll take an in-depth analysis of today's top stories by looking beyond the edge. We'll bring you not just the facts, but also deep insights into the topics with expert opinions and social media reactions. Let's make a start with our look beyond the edge. Iran and the global nuclear watchdog have found themselves in disagreement over the contents of an understanding reached earlier this month, which was part of efforts to restore the 2015 nuclear deal. Iran has also responded to Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett's speech at the UN General Assembly, accusing him of trying to propagate Iran-phobia and cleanse Israel's actions across the region. Why is there disagreement after agreement was reached earlier this month? The lead judge investigating last year's massive blast in Beirut's port had to suspend his work in the case after a former cabinet minister demanded his dismissal. Judge Tarek Bitar, the second judge to lead the complicated investigation, called off questioning of a former military intelligence general scheduled for Monday after he was informed of the new legal challenge. Can justice be ensured in the investigation in the near future? And as unrest spreads across Yemen in the face of widespread poverty and a crumbling currency, Yemen's Minister of Foreign Affairs and Expatriates Affairs, Ahmed Awid bin Mubarak, called on the United Nations to provide a package of financial support. The war in Yemen has devastated the economy and depleted foreign exchange reserves in the impoverished Arabian Peninsula nation, which imports the bulk of its goods. How can the ongoing humanitarian crisis be stopped in the country? These are the top three stories that we'll be taking a look at today from Beyond the Edge. Let's get started. Despite the string of attacks that Iran has faced in the recent past, the country's nuclear program has a long history. Our infographic explains. Iran's so-called refusal to grant the International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors access to its nuclear site has prompted strong protests from the US and European countries amid efforts to revive the 2015 nuclear deal.
Access to an Iranian nuclear site 25 miles northwest of Tehran, which was allegedly targeted by saboteurs in June, has become a bone of contention between Iran and the West. Iran has rejected the latest report by the International Atomic Energy Agency, which accuses the Middle Eastern country of failing to honour the deal struck with the watchdog 2 weeks ago. Calling the report biased and inaccurate, Iran's foreign minister called upon the International Atomic Energy Agency not to disrupt the constructive process. Earlier this month, Iran allowed the UN nuclear watchdog to service the surveillance cameras installed at its nuclear sites in a bid to ease concerns over Iran's nuclear activities.
All red lines have been crossed, inspections ignored, all wishful thinking proven false. Iran is currently violating the IAEA's safeguard agreements, and it's getting away with it.
Iran's so-called refusal to grant IAEA inspectors access to the site has prompted strong protests from the United States and European countries. The European Union countries urged Tehran to provide IAEA inspector access to the nuclear site in western Tehran. The dispute comes amidst heightened tensions between Iran and the West, with efforts to revive the stalled 2015 nuclear deal.
There are those in the world who seem to view Iran's pursuit of nuclear weapons as an inevitable reality, as a done deal, or they've just become tired of hearing about it. Israel doesn't have that privilege. We cannot tire. We will not tire. Israel will not allow Iran to acquire a nuclear weapon.
And I'm joined live from Tehran in Iran by Dr. Mohammad Marandi, who's a Tehran University professor and political commentator. Dr. Marandi, thank you so much for joining us again here today on The Edge.
Thank you for having me.
Now, as I see, there are two distinct issues going on here. One is the comments that we've just been listening to from the UNGA, which maybe if we can come to in just a moment. But first of all, the main topic is the fact that while the IAEA says that Iran is following the necessary steps with the nuclear deal, as agreed earlier this month, that there is just one site that isn't being addressed, and that's causing a problem between the US and European parties. What can you tell us about that first?
It's one camera at one site, and the Iranians have said that was not a part of the agreement. That site was attacked with drones, or a drone, about 3.5 months ago. And actually, the Iranians are very surprised, or not really surprised, but they should be surprised, that the International Atomic Energy Agency has not condemned an attack on nuclear facilities in Iran. So at the moment, the intelligence services and the judiciary are investigating, and therefore the Iranians do not believe that it is appropriate to have a camera there, that particular camera, when there's an ongoing investigation. So if the International Atomic Energy Agency is unhappy, then it should condemn such attacks. And then if they show the minimal amount of goodwill, that would both be a positive sign to Iranians, and it would also dissuade aggressive regimes such as the United States and Israel from carrying out such illegal attacks.
Now, this attack at Karaj, I think it's just worth sticking on that just for one moment, because this obviously is a very important thing. A nuclear facility, any type of accident or attack or whatever, should send shockwaves and responses. But you're saying that as of yet, there's been no condemnation for this. Why?
Well, the International Atomic Energy Agency is a Western-dominated organization. Like almost all international bodies, Western countries have more or less full control. They're almost all based in Western countries anyway. Even their local staff are Western for the most part. So it's not surprising. According to WikiLeaks, the previous head of this body, in order to get elected, he told the Americans that I will do whatever you say on the major issues, and that got him the job. And the current head of the body is also someone who the Americans wanted. So there's no surprise there. But the point is that Iran is not a country that is going to be intimidated by the United States or by the IAEA. It's already shown that. So if they want to solve the problem, they have to move away from such attempts at isolating Iran or giving misleading information to the public in the hope that the Iranians will be intimidated and the Iranians will back down. that's not going to work. It's only going to push Iran in the opposite direction, as we have already seen over the past few years. So a lack of condemnation is basically what because of Western pressure, and we don't expect that to change in the future, and that's why the relationship between Iran and this international body is complicated.
And of course, this brings us up to the UNGA. And first of all, let's talk about the comments that President Raisi made, saying that they're wanting to move forward with the JCPOA, but the negotiations are dependent upon what?
Well, it depends on whether the Europeans and the Americans want to be serious. So far, we haven't seen them make any serious moves. There has been a deal that was signed between Iran and the P5+1. The Americans left the deal. The Europeans violated the deal. And now the Europeans and the Americans want a different deal. They don't want to go back to what they signed on to. They want to keep some of the sanctions that were put in place by Trump, and they want to have Iran carry out extra limitations or accept extra limitations. And the Iranians are saying that's never going to happen. That's just impossible. If Iran wanted to appease Western regimes, they would have done it during the Trump presidency. So Biden's maximum pressure sanctions, which target women and children intentionally, are simply an extension of Trump's. There's been no change in policy, and Iran's policy is not going to change either. So Mr. Raisi has basically been saying, look, we are more than willing to implement the deal, but we're only willing to implement the deal that both sides have already agreed upon. And
alongside that, as we just heard, Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett using very strong words at the UN General Assembly, which have been rebutted by diplomatic sources in Iran, accusing it of Iran-phobia and having malicious goals. How do you respond to Bennett?
Well, Bennett famously said once that I've killed Arabs, and there's nothing wrong with that. So such a supremacist and someone who heads a regime that is openly an apartheid regime, it's obvious that he should be making such statements at the UN Security Council. And the irony, of course, is that there's no evidence that Iran's nuclear program is anything but peaceful. But we know that the Israeli regime has, according to some estimates, up to 200 nuclear warheads, just like its sister apartheid regime in South Africa, which had nuclear warheads. So he is not in a position to make any claims about Iran, and he's not in a position to threaten Iran either. The Israeli regime, it's a small regime, is completely dependent on NATO and its Western allies to sustain the apartheid system that it has in place. Iran is a powerful country with powerful regional allies. Any attack by the Israeli regime would face a massive and disproportionate counterstrike from Iran. And that is the reason why the Israelis talk, but they don't carry out attacks, because they know in such an exchange they would both lose in the eyes of the international community because they'll be seen as the aggressor, and they'll also lose in the military sense because Iran's missile capabilities, Iran's drone capabilities far outweigh that of Israel, and Iran is a huge country, as I said, with allies across the region.
And yet, still, they make direct threats against Iran in the UNGA. If this attack at Karaj was indeed formulated by the Israeli government, as has been suggested by various sources, is there a credible threat going forward that Israel will continue to make similar attacks in the future?
Well, the Israeli regime can't carry out any real attacks without U.S. support. On its own, it doesn't have that capability. And those capabilities are very limited. The drone strike was a very small strike, but still it's important to Iran. So on the one hand, by threatening Iran, they're violating international law. By attacking Iran, Western regimes are violating international law. But they do know that there will be a response. What we saw recently after they started attacking Iranian ships, when they were hit back just as hard, all these attacks stopped. And Western countries were only outraged when the Israeli ships were hit. But when the Iranian ships were hit, they were more than happy to see that happen. Just like when the Western countries tried to strangle Syria or Lebanon or Venezuela from obtaining fuel for ordinary citizens, they get outraged when the Iranians send fuel to help the people. But ultimately, they can't stop Iran. So the Israelis, it's in their own interest not to make any foolish moves. If they want to pretend that they're powerful, they can rant and rave. But if push comes to shove, they'll be hurt more than anyone else.
Well, it makes it even more important that everyone gets back round to the negotiating table and finds the peaceful solution. Dr. Mohammed Randi, thank you so much for joining us again here today on The Edge. Now, 6 rounds of talks in Vienna to restore the accord concluded on the 20th of July this year. The administration of Iran's new president, Ebrahim Raisi, has said that it is reviewing the negotiation records and will come back to the negotiating table very soon. However, Raisi told the United Nations General Assembly last week that any talks to restore the deal must lead to the lifting of American sanctions imposed by former US President Donald Trump. We will keep reporting on the nuclear tensions between Iran and the West, but for now let's move on to our next topic to speak about the Beirut blast investigation. On the 4th of August 2020, the massive blast devastated the Beirut port area, killing hundreds of people. Our following infographic is the facts. For a second time, the investigation into the blast which devastated the Lebanese capital in 2020 has been suspended, causing outrage from families still mourning the loss of those killed on that day.
A probe into the catastrophic Beirut port explosion faced the risk of being derailed for the second time this year on Monday, when a senior politician wanted for questioning filed a complaint doubting the lead investigator's impartiality. The move followed a smear campaign by Lebanon's political class against Judge Tariq Bitar, who was appointed after his predecessor was forced out following similar accusations by officials he wanted to question about suspected negligence. Prime Minister Najib Mikati expressed hope Bitar would continue in his role, saying Lebanon could not bear the removal of a second judge after the complaint led to the probe being frozen pending a court ruling. More than a year after the blast, attempts to bring any senior officials to account for more than 200 lives lost and thousands injured have made no progress, with powerful parties including Hezbollah and others in the ruling elite alleging bias in the investigation. The probe was frozen on Monday on the basis of the complaint by Nohat Machnouk, a former interior minister Bitar wanted to question on suspicion of negligence.
My neighborhood just became...
The blast, one of the biggest non-nuclear explosions ever recorded, was caused by a huge quantity of ammonium nitrate that was unsafely stored at the port from 2013. A judicial source told Reuters the investigation must now remain on hold until the Court of Cassation decides either to accept or reject the complaint. A spokesperson for the victims' families, whose brother was killed in the blast, said that there is great anger among families and that there is a type of disgust towards the political class. The families, who accuse Lebanon's entrenched political class of impunity, have demanded an international probe, saying every time the investigation begins, it gets blocked.
I'm joined live from Istanbul in Turkey by Bashar al-Halabi, who's an energy and geopolitical analyst. Bashar, thank you for joining us again here on The Edge. Now, we've seen anybody learning this, the news reports that we've just been watching, the political elites in Lebanon don't want to face accountability for things that have happened in the past. Well, what's your reaction to the current situation?
I mean, I can't add, or I can't even top the reaction by the spokesperson of the victims or the families of the victims, which really highlights a certain level of, a huge level of disgust. And what happened in the past few hours in Lebanon is really another gut punch, not only for the victims, but also for and their families, I mean, but also for the entire population, because despite the different political ramblings, despite the acute differences between different sects and different constituencies in the country, at some point, everyone thought that a massive crime that was embodied by probably the biggest non-nuclear reaction that ever shook the world, at least some sort of justice and accountability would be served for that crime, especially that mere journalistic investigations so far have uncovered a lot of the information related to the Beirut port blast, in addition to the information related to the shipment of the ammonium nitrate that was entered Lebanon's Beirut port, and that eventually exploded 7 years later. And by that, I mean the quantity of the ammonium nitrate, whatever was left of it, and not the ship itself. So there's a huge desperation, depression as well. There's a huge feelings of disgust and helplessness in a way kind of roam and lay heavy on everyone who was affected by this port blast, whether physically, emotionally, or what have you. Non-Lebanese people are worried, they're concerned, they're sad about the turn of events in the country. So imagine what the families of the victims are feeling right now.
Absolutely. Now, the interesting thing, this, as I understand it, isn't actually a criminal case, it's an inquiry. And so it's an attempt to uncover the truth of what actually happened, and along the way to find clues as who is responsible for it. But at this stage, nobody has been put in the dock accused of murder or of any particular crime, have they?
Absolutely not. But let's look at Lebanon's history, especially over the past half century. If there's one staple or one constant that has never changed in Lebanese politics, that is impunity, that reigns supreme in this country when it comes to crimes, when it comes to war crimes, and when it comes to assassinations and what have you. So this impunity shall never be compromised from a regime sense or a regime's perspective or point of view. They believe that if they only compromise for once, then this will cause a snowball effect, and the cases can be opened about previous political assassinations, corruption, and all the criminal acts that have taken place in Lebanon over the past 50 years or so. And mind you, up until today, there hasn't been a real truth and reconciliation process and a transitional justice process for the Lebanese civil war, which resulted in over 100,000 deaths and over 50,000 people who disappeared. So many loose ends kind of cause a lot of fear for the sectarian ruling elite, which is inherently and intrinsically implicated in all the crimes that happened over the past half century or so. And this is why they are going to fight tooth and nail in order to nip it in the bud and not allow even an inquiry to take place, and even not allow the Lebanese to point fingers at certain figures to be responsible for this massive criminal act that took place on August 4, 2020.
Absolutely. Now, yesterday, speaking to a Lebanese news network, Prime Minister Najib Mikati said that the suspension of the probe was a judicial matter, and but that he didn't think that Lebanon could withstand the second judge being removed. This obviously is a very powerful insight. Well, what sort of response would the Lebanese people give if this is just washed away for now?
Well, at the end of the day, Prime Minister Najib Mikati is a politician, and he's a veteran politician. So he needs to, from one side, say what he needs to say in order to reassure the international community by saying that the country cannot withstand another judge being ousted from his position in terms of investigating. But at the same time, he understands that the judiciary in Lebanon is deeply compromised and controlled or co-opted as well by the sectarian ruling elite. We know that or almost all judges are appointed through basically political appointees. So it is almost impossible to find a judge that can really pursue his work on very ethical and professional basis and principles. However, the criminal act that took place on August 4 must have shook the judges and their interior. It might have shaken them in general, and it has caused them to probably work at least to try and figure out what happened or what went down on that day. And this is something that has deeply threatened the sectarian ruling elite, and they're trying to put an end to it before it can see the light. But what might happen moving forward, we have to wait until the Cassation Court takes a decision in terms of whether it will oust Judge Fadi Bitar or whether he will be reinstated to the case and will continue his investigations. But there's a loophole that's being played, there's a loophole that's being capitalized on at the moment in the Constitution. We know that when a government is resigned, the parliament in Lebanon is in a case of continuous meetings and resembling, all right? So this offers the MPs in general a complete immunity. And anytime any MP is required to attend any kind of investigation or stand trial, then the entire parliament must agree on lifting this immunity. However, after the formation of a government, we know that there's a loophole for 15 days where MPs lose this immunity, until the next time the parliament convenes. So what Judge Bitar was trying to do is take advantage of those 15 days in order to investigate with the accused or the people that might allegedly be behind or carry some sort of responsibility for the Beirut port explosion. But what Nuhad al-Mashnu did was put an end to that by going to the Cassation Court and trying to stop Judge Bitar's inquiry through hinting at any sort of impartiality that the judge might actually suffer from. And this has happened before with Judge Hadi Sawan as well towards the end of last year, and he was ousted from his position in February. But I don't think this time, if the judge is removed from his position, then anyone is going to take seriously the Lebanese judiciary or the investigation anymore. It will basically be dead, and people will have to resort to other means. And this is very dangerous. Of course, people are calling for international investigation, but we know that this is almost impossible at the moment. It requires the UN Security Council to take action. And at the same time, if whatever is left of the citizens' trust in the Lebanese judiciary is eradicated, then I'm afraid that things might spiral out of control, because we have people who lost their beloved ones in an explosion with fingerprints of the sectarian ruling elite all over it.
Well, there's every reason that that the causes need to be found, and they need to be found, if for no other reason than to give the families of the victims some comprehension of why they lost their loved ones. Bashar al-Halabi, thank you so much for joining us here today on The Edge and bringing us up to date. Human rights groups also say that legislators facing charges using the appeals court as a stalling tactic until they win back their immunity once Parliament goes into session next month. Many of the families have also demanded an internationally led probe in order to overcome these tactics. Coming weeks will show if justice can be ensured following the blast that devastated many families. For now, let's move on to our final topic to speak about the humanitarian crisis in Yemen. The humanitarian crisis in Yemen is worsening day by day. But how did everything start, and how is the international community reacting to the crisis? Here's more. Security forces dispersed hundreds of protesters in Yemen's third largest city of Taiz on Monday as unrest over poverty spreads in areas held by the Saudi-backed government.
Dozens of people blocked the street and entrances to several districts in the disputed northwestern city of Taiz, with rocks and burning tires, before the crowd swelled to hundreds protesting sharp drops in the currency that has stoked inflation throughout Yemen. Earlier this month, 3 people were killed in violent protests in Aden and other southern cities controlled by the internationally recognized government, which was ousted from the capital Sana'a by the Houthi group in 2014. In Taiz on Monday, security forces and armed men fired shots in the air to stop protesters from ripping apart a poster of Yemen's Saudi-backed president. Police said they were committed to safeguarding citizens' rights to peaceful means of expression, but would not allow any attacks on public and private interests. The war, in which a Saudi-led coalition has been battling the Houthis for over 6 years, has devastated the economy and depleted foreign exchange reserves in the impoverished Arabian Peninsula nation, which imports the bulk of its goods. Around 80% of the population is reliant on aid, and millions face starvation in what the UN says is the world's largest humanitarian crisis.
I'm now joined live from Sana'a in Yemen by Nasser Sheker, who's a Yemeni journalist, and from Istanbul, Turkey by Adel Deşeli, who's a Yemeni researcher and writer. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining us here today on The Edge. Nasser, can I come to you first? Come direct to Yemen. The plea at the United Nations General Assembly was for aid. What is the situation right now in Sana'a and Yemen in general?
Thank you very much, Andy, for having me. The general situation in Yemen, we can say there is a lack of aid because the United Nations have been saying that they lack also the support of the international community to finance their programs, be it in regard to providing food or providing health support. The general situation, there is protest in the southern controlled governorate. The government controlled the provinces in the south of Yemen, and there are fighting on the outskirts of Marib city as well as in the northern provinces of oil-rich Shabwa between the government and the Houthis. And the civilians are continuing to pay the price of the war, of course.
As is the case in any war, which is terrible. Adel, Yemen doesn't have clear governance, as I understand it, at the moment. The factions, both the Saudi-supported government as well as the Houthis, are still warring against each other. What needs to be done to break this cycle of destruction and killing?
Thank you so much for having me. I think that we have to understand the root of the problem, or the roots of the problem. Yes, of course. Today, millions of Yemenis are in need of some forms of assistance or protections. And at the same time, 16 million of Yemenis suffer from acute food. And if we want to address the roots of the problem, we have to understand that our Yemen has been living in difficult and harsh conditions for 7 years, imposed by the militias of Al-Houthi coup. And I think that it's very important for the international community for example, to address these problems. And the problem in Yemen is not a humanitarian crisis. It's a political crisis. We have to end the military coup in Sana'a, and then we can solve the problems. Today, Houthis impose siege on Taiz, and now on the district of Al-Abdiya in the city or in the governorate of Marib. So that now the Yemeni national currency collapsed, and we have harsh conditions. And there are fightings in the west and the east at the same time. It's very difficult. International community talks about initiatives of peace, and we don't see anything on the ground. I think that now we need a ceasefire. International community must impose sanctions against Iran and it is militias in Yemen, and then we can solve these problems. Without stopping fighting, I think that we will not see peace, stability, security, and at the same time, we will see more and more harsh conditions.
Now, let's say at the General Assembly last week, the Foreign Minister Ahmed bin Mubarak spoke of the torture of citizens, the explosion of schools and places of worship, and he described Sana'a as being turned into a large prison for the Yemeni people. You're right in Sana'a right now. What is day-to-day life for you in the city?
Well, I can't comment on the speech of Ahmed bin Mubarak, because we know any political is trying to harm his opponents, okay, even with propaganda. Of course, we can say that the Houthis are angels. We can say the government also is a good government. Can you imagine President Hadi, several years ago, he said in a speech that is circulated in YouTube and criticized by all Yemenis, that Yemenis need water, need the road, need health, need education, and need the road. And he said that in a funny way, that he wants the Gulf countries and the European Union to support the Yemenis. One country support Yemenis with food, one country support Yemeni with aid, with the health, one country support Yemeni with salaries, one country support Yemenis with the road, and another country support Yemenis with the education. I don't know what's the job of the president and his government in this case. I think Ahmed bin Mubarak called for United Nations to support him financially. But we see the currency in Sana'a, $1 can exchange for 600 in Sana'a since January 2021. But in the government in January, in the government controlled areas, $1 was exchanged for 800 in January 2021. But these days, $1 is exchanged for 1,200 Yemeni rial. But in Sana'a, the dollar is stable. So there is sanctions, there are restrictions on Houthi government, and there is, a blockade on their imports and exports. But the currency is stable in Sana'a. In regard to the internationally recognized government that is supported by the European Union, by the United Nations, there is a deteriorating economic situation, especially in regard to the currency. So I think the government lacks a political or a good management, okay? Not only calling for aid, and we see at the end of the day, all the warring sides, only a limited number of the international support for Yemenis reach the need people or those people in need.
And that's an important point that you raised, that if the management, if the country has been war-torn for 7 years, so the systems, the organisations that the government might have to distribute aid and so on must have been severely broken down. So, Adel, is it just a question of balancing the currency and sending money, or how practically can aid be got to the Yemeni people?
I think that we cannot solve this problem without supporting from the international community now. Houthis have rejected all initiatives from the international community and regional powers, like the initiatives of the Saudi Arabia, to solve this crisis now. Now we have a central bank in Aden and another bank in Sana'a, and at the same time Houthis reject to deal with the Yemeni new currency. Therefore, I think that now Houthis are trying to achieve their political goals, and at the same time they didn't take care of the Yemeni people. Now, I mean that in Sana'a, for example, people without salaries for more than 5 years. Houthis didn't accept the UN's plan to provide people with salaries. And at the same time, Houthis have rejected to implement the Stockholm agreements. The previous special envoy for Yemen, Martin Griffith himself, had emphasized, and he said that Houthis want to implement some issues which are related to humanitarian issues, and at the same time, they don't want to see peace and political agreement. I think that without stopping fighting now, without ceasefire, the humanitarian crisis will continue, and maybe we will see more casualties and victims killed in this war. Today, Houthis, for example, attack IDP camps in Marib and in other cities by ballistic missiles. Okay, how can we solve the humanitarian crisis and Houthis still attack these cities? It's very difficult. International community must impose sanctions against those who don't accept peace and dialogue or negotiation to stop war in Yemen.
Well, it seems clear that it's a very difficult situation, and that humanitarian aid is urgently needed. Of course, the first thing, as you both said, is that there needs to be a cessation of hostilities and a ceasefire. I want to thank you both so much for joining us here today, and let's hope that peace can be restored to Yemen as soon as possible. Now, around 80% of the population of Yemen is reliant on aid, and millions face starvation in what the United Nations says is the world's largest humanitarian crisis. We sincerely hope that the international community will raise its voice and take action against this crisis. Our analysts have provided their insights on today's top stories. Let's have a roundup of what they had to say. Now, before closing our programme, let's take a look at social media to hear your voices and reactions on today's top story shared with the hashtag Beirut Blast. And here's what you had to say about the Beirut Blast on Twitter. Jad Chaban says no recovery without justice, no economic development without justice, no aid without justice. Justice starts in Lebanon with upholding the independent and impartial investigation into the Beirut blast. And Sayun says, Beirut blast. This is what they are trying to protect by suspending Judge Bitar. Shame on the murder cult of a government we have. 200 plus dead, 7,000 plus injured. And Aya Majoub says, Judge Bitar has been legally notified of the dismissal case against him, forcing him to suspend the investigation into the Beirut blast. No words, just more outrage. Join the families of the victims for a protest on Wednesday at 1 p.m. in front of the Justice Palace. Enough. And let's now take a look at our video of the day, which shows the alarming levels of humanitarian need among displaced Yemenis.
Conditions at the settlements are desperate, with insufficient shelter to meet the urgent needs of the growing number of displaced families. Clean water, latrines, electricity, and health facilities are in short supply. Only 21% of residents are reachable by aid organizations due to the prevailing insecurity around these sites. With limited shelter options, they are the ones who suffer most from overcrowding, lack of privacy, and limited access to basic services such as toilets or potable water. Ending the conflict is the only way to stop displacement and the suffering of Yemeni people.
And that's all for this episode of The Edge with me, Andy Boynes. Stay tuned as we'll be back tomorrow with more in-depth analysis on the top stories and a look beyond the edge.